Thank you for joining Inside the CISO's office. I'm the producer, Lance Hart. Today, we'll be talking about protecting your organization from AI risks and ransomware. I have John Brueggemann, as always. John, take it away.
Thank you, Lance. I appreciate the introduction. Welcome to Inside the CISO's office. My name is John Brueggemann. I'm a consulting CISO for CBTS and Onyx. And with me today is Josh Hankins, another consulting CISO for CBTS. Josh, give everybody a little bit of your background.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show, John. It's always a lot of fun to talk with you. Again, my name's Josh Hankins. I'm a consulting CISO at CBTS Onyx. Previously joining the organization, I worked for a financial institution for nearly 15 years, doing cybersecurity and network engineering pieces, and then moved on to some consulting roles. And before that, I worked at Qualys for a little bit as a field CISO.
Let people know what Qualys is and what they do.
Sure, that's a great idea. I should not just assume that. Qualys is a compliance and security or cybersecurity vendor, one of the very first SaaS-based platforms where they will assess or scan your assets in the cloud or on-prem. And
vulnerability management, vulnerability reporting. Gotcha.
Vulnerability management, compliance, all that fun stuff. And then before that, I was the director of security and incident response for a large retailer's analytic company.
And today we're going to talk about the buzzword of the last 2 years, basically, artificial intelligence.
Yes.
So one of the things that I get to talk to customers about a lot is the AI risks. Mm-hmm. So when I typically talk to people about AI risks, particularly as they look to develop a new program, maybe you're going to implement a chat bot, or maybe they want to use an AI tool to look at their data and determine, trends or ways that they can optimize their environment. When you work with customers that are thinking about AI, what are some of the top 2 or 3 things that you think about and want them to consider as they implement their artificial intelligence project? So what are the risks that you see?
It's a good question. I think the first thing you need to think about in terms of how do you keep your large language models and your whole AI ecosystem, whether you have it on-prem or in the cloud, pristine in terms of the integrity of your data. How do you, it's basically software development lifecycle management, essentially. You're putting in your data. How do you make sure that the data you're putting in is the right data and it hasn't been
training data.
Right, the training data, correct. It hasn't been corrupted by accident or poisoned by an adversary, so they could, maybe slow your project down or bring some other things to the knees.
Or have your AI tool report an inaccurate answer.
Correct. And you're spending more time and resources doing things that, I thought this was the right path and now I'm not, right? And then another one is you have to look at regulations and things of this nature. I know that's not very sexy. However,
it's extremely important when the lawyers come a-knocking.
Exactly. I know regulations and compliance mandates may not be sexy, but when they levy fines, that's when things become real.
Yes, without a doubt.
And that's not a lot of fun. There's a lot of time to answer those questions, but also you have to pay fines. And then
you're starting to talk like an auditor, perhaps. Maybe you have a little audit experience here.
I do. Being in financial services and some other things, I was been part of many audits, and I saw the power of audits, both good and bad, in time of preparing and responding to audits. But audits they're good. If you didn't do those, you probably wouldn't have the most up-to-date documentation.
Correct.
Training on your staff, how to recover, et cetera. Things of this nature.
So are you aware of any regulations in the AI space that you tend to bring to people's attention? In my mind, the EU has come out with their AI regulations that are already in force.
Right.
And if you're a multinational company and you want to have your product, whatever it is, there in the EU, you're going to have to comply with AI's, the European Union's AI regulation. So what would you provide or guide people to do in that kind of a context, given your audit background?
Sure. I would make sure first that you're always applying your project or your data sets, et cetera, to the highest level of the mandate that you can adhere to. So if you're doing the highest, then it's going to be a lot easier to meet the ones below it.
Good strategy.
Yeah, it's worked well for me. I know it's a lot of work at the beginning. It's a lot more work convincing people it's the right thing to do. And it's not that people don't want to do that. They have competing priorities.
Right. Frequently getting the product to market is the big competing priority.
Well, people want to make money, but
Yes.
another way to make money is to save money by not being fined heavily.
Yes.
And speaking of fines, those can be $7,500 per fine. It can be per day. It depends on the regulations.
Yes.
But a big part of that is looking ahead. And if I have to comply with a particular piece of the mandate, if I put a request in as a consumer and I want all my data forgotten about Josh, how are you going to find that? Is it going to be hard? Is it going to be easy? How much time is it going to take for your analyst or whoever to do it? So having that privacy by design step is always helpful.
Oh, yes.
And then testing it and then making sure it works as designed, maybe once a year, but at least a few times a year, depending on the
Before it goes in production,
yes.
You want to test it too.
Yes, exactly. Because you could spend a lot of time trying to retrofit that. And if you just would have done it at the beginning, you would have saved you and your company so much more time.
Right.
And it will put you ahead of your competitors, because if your competitors aren't thinking like that, they're going to be behind the 8 ball when they have to do it, while you're like, oh, we just hit the button, boom, I'm done.
Right. And I can prove that I've deleted Josh's data from my AI training model. And that actually brings up one of the other things that you and I talked about in advance, which is, let's say you've released your AI project out to the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's 6 months later, a threat actor or a competitor has decided to poison your AI model using some technique. How easy is it to get the data out to make sure that your AI model performs as you're expecting it to? So it's going to your point here where you'd want to design that in as you're building your AI model.
Right, exactly. Not just finding that data that you're sure if it's either poison or if I asked it to be removed, but also training your model to know what bad is. Right.
Yes, correct.
So
I'm not going to sell that car for a penny.
Right. Because then if it knows what malice looks like, or it thinks what malice looks like in some capacity, it maybe will do what it needs to do to not propagate it through your LLM or whatever. So
maybe it puts it in a temporary file or puts it in a temporary database associated with the model to say, we're going to take a look at this data 2 days from now, 5 days from now, or something like that. So there's ways that you can build in safety, we'll call them guardrails, to make sure that the model, if it is attacked, can be defended appropriately. Because obviously you'd always want to make a good backup of your model so that, if everything goes sideways, you're like, oh, we're going to go back to the pristine version we had on Tuesday or whatever.
I mean, you hit the nail right on the head in terms of what's my, I'm going to say back out, but my step one back strategy. Have I tested it? It's just like when, before everybody started using IPS, they had it IDS. You trained it.
Intrusion protection systems and intrusion detection systems.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that you and I are talking, and maybe some other folks that may not know what those initials are. So thank you. Typically you just don't go out of the gate in prevention where you're whacking data streams, right? Or same thing with your WAF. You let it learn and then you turn it on, right?
Yeah. Web application firewalls, the WAF. You could unintentionally do a denial of service on yourself if you make your WAF a little too effective and it blocks 90% of the traffic, and you were just trying to block the bots that are hitting your website.
Right.
So having your tools learn what is good and bad is a slower process, but it's a safer process to make sure you don't, like you say, end up doing a denial of service on yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a good point, John.
Besides AI, ransomware continues to be a big threat for everybody, and this is 2025. And have you seen a change or a shift in the ransomware attacks for the customers that you work with, or what's been your take on either the increase in attacks or the decrease in ransomware payments between 2023 and 2024?
I'm going to speak more about what efficiencies I've seen the attackers leverage and use of our good old friend AI, or artificial intelligence.
Yes.
I was looking at a case study because it was very similar to one of my clients, but this wasn't the client, but this was a case study from last year from a local global restaurant company. We'll just say that.
A restaurant chain, shall we say?
Yes, a chain. And the stores happen to be not in the United States, but over in
UK adjacent.
Yes, let's call it that, adjacent. I like your term adjacent today. So there's multiple steps when you are infiltrating an organization, as you know. And those could all be mapped to the cyber kill chain in some capacity. It's gain access, gain credentials, or credentials access, and then deploying your ransomware.
There's a couple steps you have to go through if you're an attacker.
Exactly. And a lot of that is the recon, like, hey, where's the data? What data do I want? What data am I being paid for to get? What if I get extra data? Could I monetize that as the bad person, right? In this case study, all those steps, the adversary used AI to increase the time to get to each step.
They accelerated their attack.
Exactly. And so they actually did a two-part encryption.
Two-step encryption?
Two-step, yes.
Okay.
So they, instead of encrypting everything, they got the data that they felt was the highest value from a monetary perspective, encrypted that, or took it and then encrypted it. And then they started doing your drive-by. Okay, let's get everything, see what else we can get from extortion. So they got some efficiencies in their attack methods. So good for them. I mean,
in a sense.
Exactly. Yes. I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. From a defense side, what could we do? So we talked a little bit about that in terms of understanding the behaviors, of how ransomware looks and things of this nature. If it's a time thing, if the adversary is speeding up, making things more efficient, maybe time's not going to be the vector your EDR or whatever, your endpoint detector and response agent can
do.
Yeah, react to. Parenthetically, I gave a talk last year towards the end of the year. I was working an incident at a place I worked previously. It was not ransomware, but we still had to go and do all your...
It might have looked like it. You weren't
right.
sure.
Exactly. We did all the typical steps that
for incident response.
Correct. Right. And we can list those out later because I don't remember the top of my head, but
that's okay.
I know what to do. I just know like the official names. Whatever.
Yeah. I want detect.
Yes. No, detect, contain,
right. Eradicate, and recover.
Recover.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you have your postmortem, which obviously is one of the bigger ones. But I went back as part of that talk. If I had a time machine, how would I have used AI to help me in that? So that's an unplanned event, right? And, understanding what the vulnerability is and its attack plan. I had to go through, this was in the cloud, and where did I have all the instances of the special database with a special, I'll say, characteristic turned on? Because those are the ones that we cared about.
Yeah.
So we had to find those. We weren't sure if the database was compromised or not. So we need to rotate the keys, the encryption keys. So
at least the data was encrypted in the database. Thank goodness.
Correct. And so, but we had to assume that breach, we had to assume that they had the key, but we only had to find the specific database with a specific, I call it adjective.
Okay.
This was in one of the big three cloud providers. They have their own little query language you can write to find that.
Right.
And another interesting side note to the story, we were just in our cloud infancy. So
you just started your cloud journey.
Exactly. Yeah. So understanding like what type of syntax we needed to use, like we kind of understood it, but we kind of didn't.
Because you didn't have years of experience with it.
Right. It wasn't like Cisco, like, I'll just do a show whatever and I'll find my route table and show IP route.
Yeah.
Or show ERG. Never mind. No one cares.
Yeah.
I care. But at any rate.
Luckily, you don't have to program routers anymore for your daily living.
No, no, thank you. I don't know.
It's a good skill to have.
It is. No, thanks.
Probably not helpful on Survivor Island, but one never knows.
No, not helpful on Survivor Island. Yeah. But I did learn a lot as a network engineer.
So you basically had your incident in your head because you experienced it. You went through it and you said, what AI tools are available to me to speed up my own reconnaissance / detection work?
Right.
And what was the most helpful tool for you when you did that?
Well, just one of the basics. I said, hey, I was using I did it with both Copilot and ChatGPT. I said, this is a general item I'm looking for. I need to find all the databases that are this type of database with this type of encryption mechanism and setting, essentially. I need you to write me a query. And this is the cloud provider. And so it did. And it looked right because I already knew it was right because I ran the thing. But also you had to know the words, like certain verbs to avoid.
Yes.
Drop.
Yes.
Delete table.
Little Bobby tables.
Yes. Some analog to that. So that's where you really have to understand the question you're asking, how you train it. I couldn't assume that the model knew about the vulnerability. So first I told it about it. And I said, now learn its attack vector, and it did. And then I said, I need to find where all these devices are in the cloud. And so we look about that. We gained about 3 hours of time back.
For your incident response, you would have shrunk the window for determining that this was not an incident by 3 hours.
Right.
So instead of going home at midnight, you got to go home at 9 p.m.
Correct.
or something.
At least for me, when I used to run incidents, one of the biggest things is to react with passion, but not fear.
Right.
So you have to be diligent, but not, well, I think this is going to work. We got to save time. On certain situations, yes, but you really have to be, what am I doing? Is it going to make things worse, better, or the same? And so being a little bit more pragmatic is definitely a skill you need to have, and also understand the incident, the impact of the business.
Right.
So we were a little bit longer on that because that was a longer journey in terms of us. Well, we think the query language works like this, but we're not sure. And we know that we're putting in there isn't going to break anything, but is it going to give us the right results back?
Right.
So there's a lot of validation with that, and making sure you found everything. And that's always something in the back of your brain. Like, did we get all the databases? Like, because it only takes one that, well, because it was behind a firewall or something, we didn't find it. So.
Right. And you were looking at, I'm going to make up a number, 200 databases in your cloud instance, or was it bigger than that?
It was around 200, but then there were some other orgs that were kind of tied into as well. So once we were working it together with them, so when you look at it in totality, probably over 500.
Yeah, that's a lot to look at. And verifying that you've identified the correct databases required some manual overview, because, you had a script, the script ran, it said, look at this database, it has these items in it with this encryption turned on. You validated that script returned appropriate results, but you weren't going to check all 300 of them or 200 or whatever number, right?
Spot check. I mean, that's the yin and the yang. If I don't have, we can shut off the internet connections to it, but then,
hard to do a query.
Right, hard to do a query and all that fun stuff. But we spot checked it, and then we felt good that what we had was just doing discovery, and then that list was good, and then we set up some times to regenerate the keys on the database.
Yep,
so.
It takes time to do that. So
yep.
Well, and it's a decent segue into the next topic that most people probably aren't focusing as much on, which is like data privacy laws and the whole legislative and regulatory landscape that the United States is. Because unlike the European Union that has the GDPR, which is the General Data Privacy Regulation, which came out in 2018. So it's been around for a long time.
Yep.
The United States has a patchwork of privacy laws. A couple of them come to mind for me. The big one, the state of California came out with, there's the California Consumer Rights Act, CCRA, and then there's CCPA.
Right.
So the Rights Act came after the Privacy Act. When you think about regulations, what are the ones that you tend to focus on when you're consulting with a customer to help them be aware of the privacy concerns that they need to think about?
Sure. It depends on their business, where they're located, and the type of data. If it's credit card or debit, obviously you have to consider PCI. But if it's not something that's as overt as that.
Which has clear guidelines.
Right.
PCI has clear guidelines. You know whether you're compliant or not.
Right. As much as PCI is PCI, but at least, like you said, you can go down the box and check it. If you're an issuer, you're an acquirer, you have to do this, you have to do that, how often you have to do it, and what constitutes evidence for the auditors, right?
Yes.
Now, if you're in a more less prescriptive world, potentially HIPAA, I mean, that's still somewhat prescriptive, but not as descriptive as PCI. Or if you feel like you'll have to adhere to any of the California privacy rights, just make sure, do the one, either that one or the one maybe above it in terms of what your business is for. And then you're never going to fail an audit for being over evidenced.
Right. It never hurts to be too secure.
Right.
Because like when you said that your database was encrypted, that's great, because one of the questions I always ask my customers when I'm helping them determine whether or not they have compliance issues is, is the data encrypted at rest? Are you encrypting your backups? Is the data encrypted in transit? Are you using, transport layer security, TLS? And then I kind of like cross my fingers and hope they're encrypting it inside the database. That doesn't happen as much as I'd like. It would definitely make sense, as you say, to go above perhaps the bare minimum requirement to meet a compliance regulation.
Right. And there's also a cost, money costs and people doing work costs. But if it's not that much more, it's probably worth it. If it's astronomically more, I would just document it. It's because
you can get exceptions.
Right. You can get an exception, or somebody's going to ask, well, why didn't you do this? Well, that would have costed, $30 million.
More development work.
Right.
Yeah.
And
to achieve this particular compliance.
Right. And is that going to get us to the right regulation level for us at this moment? No, we don't need that because our product doesn't do X, Y, Z, maybe down the road.
Right.
Things of that nature.
It's always a trade-off. And,
right.
and security, in my mind, is a tool that can enable the organization to be more successful because you'll know that your data is secure. You know that you have good controls in place. You can audit it, and you can demonstrate to the auditors with evidence that you're meeting these criteria.
Right.
So.
I did a talk maybe 2 years ago about why audit is important. And even in organizations that may think if they're not publicly traded or they don't do anything that's like PCI related, you should always act like at one point you're going to get audited. Case in point, 5, 8, maybe 10 years ago, there was a company we were looking to buy over in the EU, very small company. Essentially, they lost out millions of euros because they just didn't have any basic documentation of how do you control your source code, who has access to it. Now, this doesn't need to be tomes of documentation, but a few Visios or network diagrams,
something,
throw
me a bone.
Your product may be great, but we're being looked to be bought by a bigger company if you can't prove that you wrote the algorithms, if you don't have a patent, et cetera. They work, you've tested them, or your source
keep them
code is
secure,
valid.
and you keep them secure. Because if your value add is an algorithm that you developed yourself, you might want to keep that security very close, that product well covered and well protected. So regulation is important. And I think that's a good note for us to end on because we could talk about regulation for 30 minutes very easily.
Right.
And as you said, not everybody finds regulation interesting, but your points are good. Auditing is important, being able to have evidence, and the fact that a company could lose value even if they're not publicly traded because they can't provide evidence that they're doing what they say they're doing.
Exactly.
Thanks again, Josh. I appreciate your time here, and I'm sure we'll be talking more later.
I really enjoyed it, John. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Yep.